It was the summer of 1945, and the war in the Pacific had finally drawn to a close. On a remote American military base in the Philippines, Japanese prisoners of war, young men scarcely older than 18, shuffled warily through the sweltering heat. Their uniforms were tattered, faces hollow from months of starvation, and eyes haunted by memories of battles fought across the islands, of comrades lost to disease, hunger, and gunfire. The smell of sweat and smoke clung to the air as the guards led them past rows of neatly arranged tents, an orderliness so foreign to the chaos they had endured that it seemed unreal. In the distance, the hum of generators blended with the distant clang of mess hall utensils. The POWs had grown accustomed to scarcity, thin rice gruel, the occasional ration of fish, and the bitter taste of desperation. Their stomachs had been empty for days, their hands calloused from labor and endless marching. And yet, as they approached the mess hall, something unfamiliar shimmered in the sunlight, the scent of hot bread, roasted meat, and sweet, creamy desserts carried on the humid breeze. Their eyes widened in disbelief, scanning long tables meticulously laid with gleaming utensils, white plates, steaming bowls of soup, and fresh fruit. For these young men, conditioned to hunger and austerity, the scene was almost too much to comprehend. The guards watched silently, aware of the fragile tension in the air. Then, one by one, the prisoners were guided to the tables, and the first bites were offered. A single mouthful of meat, rich and tender, caused a ripple across the room. Some coughed. The mess hall was a world apart from anything the Japanese prisoners of war had known since their capture. The structure itself, modest yet orderly, gleamed in the mid-morning light, each polished table reflecting the soft hum of activity within. From the moment the prisoners stepped inside, their senses were assaulted by a combination of sights, sounds, and smells that were entirely foreign to them, yet impossible to ignore. The air carried the warm, comforting aroma of freshly baked bread, still slightly crisp along its golden edges, mingling with the earthy fragrance of simmering vegetables and the rich, savory scent of meat roasting slowly over an open fire. These were smells the men had scarcely experienced in months, years even, for many had subsisted on thin rice gruel, meager rations, and whatever scraps could be scavenged in the unforgiving environments of the Pacific Islands. They paused at the entrance, a silent hesitation marking their every step, their eyes scanning the neatly aligned tables as if they were part of a dream they could not yet comprehend. The sunlight streaming through high windows caught the steam rising from bowls of thick, golden broth, casting ephemeral halos in the warm air, and every prisoner instinctively stepped closer, drawn by a combination of hunger, curiosity, and disbelief. For many of these young men, barely into adulthood and hardened by the brutality of war, the scene seemed almost unreal. Their uniforms hung in tatters, patched repeatedly, bearing the marks of months of hard labor, exposure to rain and sun, and the relentless wear of battle. Their faces were pale and drawn, sunken eyes betraying sleepless nights and the gnawing ache of near-constant hunger. Hands calloused and scarred from work and combat, twitched slightly as if uncertain what to do with themselves, unused to the presence of abundance rather than deprivation. Each step forward was tentative, cautious, almost reverent, and yet curiosity overpowered fear, and the prisoners inched closer to the tables, their gazes fixed on the unfamiliar bounty before them. They had learned through bitter experience that generosity was rare, that abundance was almost always accompanied by danger or deceit, And so the very act of seeing well-arranged plates filled with steaming food created a tension that hovered in the room like an invisible weight. They whispered softly among themselves in low, careful tones, Japanese words flowing quietly from parched lips, a mixture of disbelief and cautious speculation. Some tilted their heads to each other, eyes wide, pointing at bowls of thick stew, slices of fruit, and loaves of bread still warm from the oven, marveling at the vivid colors and textures that seemed almost impossibly foreign after months of uniform monotony. The vegetables were bright and fresh, their greens and oranges and reds stark against the white enamel of the bowls, each piece meticulously cut and arranged. The meat glistened with a richness that was almost offensive to men who had eaten only thin rations of dried fish and the occasional morsel of meat scraped together from the remnants of battle. The bread, golden brown and soft, released small clouds of steam when torn, and the prisoners' noses twitched involuntarily at the scent of butter and yeast. They approached the tables with hesitant hands, fingers trembling slightly, unsure whether they were allowed to take a piece or whether the generosity was some kind of trap. A few of the men looked to the American cooks, silent, steady, and patient, their uniforms crisp and clean, hands moving smoothly as they replenished bowls and carried trays with practiced ease. The prisoners watched these movements closely, noting how nothing was hurried or forced, how every gesture carried an unspoken calm, a rhythm that seemed utterly foreign to the chaos of war they had endured. For these men, who had been trained to be vigilant, to expect hostility at every turn, and to endure suffering without complaint, the sight of careful, methodical service was disorienting. Some lowered their heads, unable to meet the eyes of the Americans, almost ashamed of their own astonishment, while others froze entirely, staring at the food as though it might vanish before they could even touch it. When the first bowls of soup were placed in front of them, thick and fragrant with vegetables and meat, the prisoners paused. A single spoonful, held tentatively, seemed to weigh more than any battle they had fought. One young man lifted the spoon to his lips, swallowed, and nearly choked on the richness and warmth. The flavor so foreign it triggered a wave of emotion that he struggled to control. Another shook his head slightly, blinking rapidly, trying to suppress tears that came unbidden, born from a mixture of relief, disbelief, and an almost childlike joy he had not felt in years. The simple act of eating, something that had become purely mechanical during months of deprivation, had transformed into a profound revelation. The rich flavors, the textures, the warmth, they spoke of care, of thought, of humanity, of a world where scarcity did not dominate every moment. Some prisoners exchanged glances, their eyes wide, silently communicating that what they were experiencing went beyond nourishment. It was an emotional awakening, a recognition that survival could include moments of comfort and dignity. Across the room, the subtle clatter of utensils punctuated the otherwise hushed atmosphere as more bowls and plates were set before those who had not yet tasted. A few men hesitated to reach for the food, their bodies stiff with suspicion, as if expecting that the generous meal was somehow a prelude to punishment. Others dove in cautiously, lifting pieces of bread or scoops of soup with trembling hands, savoring every bite as if it were a treasure they had fought decades to earn. In that hall, the prisoners experienced a collision between past and present. The bitter memories of hunger and suffering juxtaposed against a present that was rich, vibrant, and unexpectedly compassionate. The experience was overwhelming, Yet no one in the room spoke of it aloud, for words seemed inadequate to describe the sensation of being fed in such abundance after prolonged deprivation. A few of the older prisoners, who had seen comrades collapse from starvation or disease, turned their heads slightly, hiding their faces as tears ran freely down their cheeks, unable to reconcile the enormity of the gesture with their hardened expectations of cruelty. And yet, even among the youngest, the men scarcely more than teenagers, the effect was undeniable. Their bodies, long starved, responded instinctively, muscles relaxing, stomachs filling, minds briefly lifting from the endless loop of survival. It was not merely the physical sustenance that moved them. It was the realization that care could exist in a place that had once been defined by conflict and hatred. They watched as Americans moved silently among them, offering gentle nods, refilling plates, ensuring none went without. This quiet, methodical generosity was as foreign as it was comforting, a rhythm that seemed almost ceremonial in its precision. Each bite became a meditation, a reconnection to senses long dulled by deprivation. Each swallow a small act of trust, a subtle surrender to the unfamiliar kindness extended to them. The prisoners began to notice details they had never truly appreciated: the warmth radiating from bowls of stew, the soft texture of freshly baked bread, the delicate sweetness of fruit glinting in the sunlight. They touched the utensils, smooth and cool, marveling at the refinement compared to the rough, makeshift tools they had been forced to use in the field. Every sensory detail reinforced the reality that this meal was not merely food, but a statement, a bridge from the brutality of war to the fragile civility of human compassion. And as each man took bite after bite, a quiet transformation occurred. Shoulders, previously hunched and tense, relaxed slightly. Eyes, previously haunted and wary, flickered with the beginnings of astonished wonder. The mess hall had become a theater of emotional revelation, where the simple act of eating unveiled layers of memory, longing, and rediscovered humanity. What had begun as tentative steps toward the tables now became full engagement with the experience, a willingness to feel, to trust, to be nourished not only in body but in spirit. As the prisoners continued to eat, whispers filled the room, subtle murmurs of amazement and disbelief, spoken in Japanese and carried softly on the humid air. Some chuckled nervously, unable to reconcile the abundance with their expectations of hardship. Outside the mess hall, the sun hung low in the sky, its fading light spilling across the dusty expanse of the POW camp, casting long, stretching shadows over the uneven ground, over tents pitched in meticulous rows, and over the men who had just experienced a moment that defied their expectations. The air was heavy with heat, and the faint aroma of earth mingled with the lingering scent of cooking, a reminder of the life and care being provided inside the hall. The young Japanese prisoners, their uniforms worn and patched, faces still streaked with sweat and dust, moved slowly, almost reverently, toward the open windows and doorways, as if drawn by the need to linger in the soft, forgiving light. Each man carried the memory of the meal in his hands, in the warm sensation that lingered in his stomach, and in the subtle realization that what had just happened was rare, almost miraculous. There were no words yet, only tentative glances, soft shifts of weight, and the quiet rustle of fabric, as the men adjusted to a world that had offered them kindness rather than the harshness they had known for so long. They whispered in low, cautious tones to one another, voices threading through the warm evening air like fragile silk, discussing flavors that seemed impossibly rich, textures that were entirely new, the sheer abundance of food laid out with care, the gentle attention given by the Americans who had prepared it. It was as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the prisoners to process the collision of expectation and reality, the harshness of their past, and the generosity of this moment. The young men's faces were etched with disbelief, with emotions too raw and unfamiliar to name. Some pressed their palms to their mouths, stifling small sounds of astonishment, while others tilted their heads back, blinking rapidly to clear tears that had formed without warning. The meal, simple in its components, stew, bread, fruit, had awakened a cascade of emotions that could not be contained within the walls of ordinary comprehension. They looked to one another for confirmation, searching faces like their own for the same signs of recognition that they themselves felt so intensely. There was a shared understanding, silent yet profound, that what had been offered to them went beyond nourishment. It was a bridge to something they had long forgotten: trust, human connection, and the quiet power of generosity. The whispers grew tentative at first, then bolder as men commented softly on flavors that had once seemed impossible, on the textures that surprised them, on the richness of food that seemed almost luxurious in comparison to the rations they had received while in hiding or captivity. "It is enough," one murmured, almost to himself, a tremor in his voice betraying the depth of feeling beneath the words. Another shook his head in disbelief, tracing the rim of his bowl with a finger, as if the simple act of touching it might somehow anchor the reality of the moment. The sun continued to drop, streaking the camp with a golden-orange hue, accentuating the contrast between the shadowed tents and the illuminated faces of the prisoners. Each long shadow seemed to stretch not just across the earth, but across time itself, connecting the brutality of their past experiences with the fragile hope offered by the present. The wind whispered softly through the camp, carrying the faint clatter of utensils and the occasional hum of conversation from inside the mess hall. Even this background noise seemed to affirm the possibility of normalcy, of ordinary life continuing despite the years of conflict that had defined the prisoners' existence. The men lingered near the windows and doors, unwilling to retreat to their assigned quarters, as if leaving the light and warmth would mean leaving behind the fleeting gift they had received. Some of the prisoners crouched slightly to rest on the ground, holding their bowls in their laps, savoring the last bites of soup or bread as the day's heat slowly faded. They passed slices of fruit to one another in silent gestures of shared joy. Tentative yet deliberate, each movement an acknowledgement of the human bonds that were being forged in this improbable setting. Eyes met across the space, and fleeting smiles, hesitant, fragile, but genuine, emerged, bridging the cultural and linguistic gaps that had once defined them as enemies. The men spoke softly of the unexpected kindness of the Americans who had risked little yet given so much, and of the way that a single meal could carry the weight of understanding, compassion, and humanity. These were not idle words, they were spoken with reverence, as though uttering them aloud might solidify the experience in a reality that felt almost too good to be true. They discussed the warmth of the stew, the freshness of the bread, the sweetness of the fruit, and each description seemed to carry more than mere flavor. It carried astonishment, relief, and a subtle grief for the years of hunger and struggle that had preceded this moment. The young soldiers leaned slightly toward one another, sharing observations in hushed tones, trying to translate their astonishment into words that could capture the enormity of what they were feeling. It was a delicate, almost sacred exchange, a mutual recognition that what had occurred was not simply a meal, but a testament to something larger. The enduring potential for human decency, even in the aftermath of conflict and suffering. The camp itself seemed to take on a new life as evening approached. Dust particles shimmered in the low sun like tiny sparks floating lazily in the warm air, catching the light in a way that made the moment feel suspended in time. The prisoners' shadows stretched long across the dirt paths, exaggerated and wavering, almost as if the earth itself were marking the passage of this extraordinary event. A few young men sat on the ground, backs against tent walls, savoring the sensation of fullness in their stomachs, hands lingering on bowls they had emptied only moments before, as if reluctant to relinquish the proof of abundance that they had so long been denied. Their expressions were a complex mix of confusion, awe, and gratitude, as the tension between disbelief and reality played across their features. One soldier traced the seam of his tattered uniform, a subconscious gesture that connected him to the harshness of his past, even as his eyes remained fixed on the fading light and the camaraderie forming around him. Another pressed a hand to his chest, a soft sigh escaping his lips, the kind of involuntary sound that spoke volumes about the quiet relief washing over him. Around them, the murmurs continued, voices threading through the camp like a delicate wind, carrying descriptions of the food, small jokes, shared laughter, and whispered comments that were remarkable only for their lightness and humanity after months of deprivation. Some of the prisoners, moved beyond words, allowed themselves small gestures of gratitude, a bow of the head, a quiet nod, a soft smile directed toward the cooks or the guards. Each movement was understated yet resonant, a reflection of the profound respect and amazement inspired by an act so simple in intention yet monumental in effect. Even the youngest men, barely adults themselves, displayed a kind of quiet maturity, understanding that generosity was rare and fragile, and that this fleeting moment could not be taken for granted. They were learning, almost instinctively, that human kindness, even in small forms, could leave an indelible mark. The sun sank further, casting long, diffuse rays that slanted across the camp, catching in the folds of uniforms, in the lines of dirt and sweat on young faces, highlighting the stark contrast between their worn, battle-scarred appearance and the radiant warmth of the light around them. In that golden hour, every detail, the texture of bread, the soft glisten of soup, the smooth surface of fruit, the careful arrangement of tables, the gentle, patient movements of those serving, was magnified in significance. It was not merely sustenance they were receiving, it was a lesson in empathy, a quiet testament to the enduring possibility of decency in a world that had too often. As the last vestiges of sunlight faded across the camp, the atmosphere shifted, carrying with it a subtle, almost imperceptible energy that seemed to bridge past suffering and present relief. The Japanese prisoners, young men hardened by combat, exhaustion, and starvation, now found themselves caught in a delicate moment of humanity that transcended the boundaries of language, culture, and wartime animosity. The mess hall had emptied, but the imprint of the meal lingered in every detail. The warmth in their bellies, the lingering flavors of stew and bread, the faint sweetness of fruit, and the almost tangible sense of care that had been poured into every plate. They lingered in small clusters, some sitting on the ground near the edges of the camp, others standing in quiet contemplation, hands still brushing over the smooth surfaces of their bowls, reluctant to let the tangible evidence of abundance slip away. Their bodies, long conditioned to hunger and vigilance, began to relax slowly, the tension in shoulders and backs easing as if the simple act of being fed could release more than just their physical emptiness. Their faces, previously etched with fatigue and weariness, now carried expressions of astonishment, disbelief, and an emerging tenderness that had been buried beneath months of survival instinct. The young men began to speak quietly to one another, sharing descriptions of the meal in tones that carried awe and a fragile, hesitant joy. "The bread," one murmured, tracing the outline of an imaginary loaf with his fingers in the dust, "it is soft, so soft and warm." Another nodded, eyes wide, whispering about the richness of the stew, how it carried layers of flavor they had long forgotten, and how the simple act of tasting it had moved something deep within him. The conversation was tentative, almost reverent, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile perfection of the experience. They shared gestures of understanding, pointing to the fading traces of food and motioning toward one another with shy smiles, tentative nods, and quiet laughter that was soft, almost afraid of being too bold. The language of gratitude was subtle, expressed more through eyes, hands, and posture than words. In this quiet communion, barriers of nationality and wartime allegiance dissolved. The men realized, without explicitly saying so, that this meal had created a shared understanding, a recognition that despite years of violence and suffering, simple acts of generosity could still reach across divides. As twilight deepened, the camp itself seemed to breathe differently. Shadows lengthened across the tents, rippling in the faint evening breeze, and the world outside the mess hall grew still, as though acknowledging the extraordinary intimacy that had formed among the prisoners. They walked slowly along the dirt paths, some lingering near the remaining light that spilled from the mess hall windows, savoring the last moments of warmth and the residual scent of food that clung to the air. A few of the younger prisoners sat cross-legged, holding their bowls in their laps, fingers tracing the empty edges, as if to remember the sensation of abundance. Others pressed a hand to their chests, soft sighs escaping their lips, involuntary expressions of awe and gratitude at the generosity that had been extended to them. The day's heat had softened, replaced by the gentle cool of evening, yet it was not the temperature that brought comfort. It was the recognition that they had been seen, cared for, and nourished in a way that transcended survival alone. For so long they had known only scarcity, deprivation, and the constant threat of harm. Now, for the first time in months, perhaps years, they had encountered a deliberate kindness that required no repayment, no expectation, and no ulterior motive. The young soldiers began to interact more openly, tentative at first, then with growing confidence, sharing small observations about what they had eaten, pointing out flavors and textures, gestures and glances steeped in wonder. A piece of fruit might be offered from one hand to another, a tiny smile exchanged over the simple act, and laughter, soft and hesitant, floated across the dusty paths. Their bodies relaxed further with each shared glance, each whispered comment, each careful observation of the nuances of flavor that had once been unimaginable. Even the most hardened among them, the men who had survived on the thinnest rations and witnessed the deaths of comrades, found themselves softened, touched by the quiet humanity that had been offered freely. It was not merely the food itself that stirred these reactions, but the act of giving, the deliberate choice to care, the careful orchestration of a meal designed to comfort and nourish, rather than punish or humiliate. In that understanding, a profound emotional shift occurred, one that would leave a lasting imprint far beyond the physical memory of the meal. The twilight deepened into early night, stars beginning to pierce the darkening sky, and still the prisoners lingered in small groups. Some leaned against tent walls, the fading light casting subtle highlights across their worn faces, while others moved slowly along the paths, absorbing the quiet atmosphere and reflecting on the unexpected generosity they had witnessed. Fingers brushed against the rough fabric of their uniforms, traces of dust clinging to hands that had known only hard labor and battle, and yet those same hands had also held plates of warm, comforting food, connecting the past to the present in a tactile, almost sacred way. The sounds of the camp, distant murmurs, the soft movement of wind through tents, the occasional clink of utensils being cleaned, created a quiet soundtrack for their reflections, each noise echoing softly against the backdrop of memory and gratitude. In these moments, the young men felt an awareness of something larger than themselves, a sense that acts of kindness, however small or ordinary to the giver, could carry immense weight for those who had been deprived of hope. They began to recognize that the significance of this meal would not fade with the night, that the feelings it had awakened, trust, astonishment, compassion, would endure, quietly shaping their perception of humanity in a world that had often denied it. Some prisoners found themselves alone in contemplation, sitting cross-legged beneath the first glimmers of starlight, tracing the contours of empty bowls, savoring the memory of warmth, richness, and care. Others gathered in small clusters, voices barely audible, recounting favorite flavors, describing textures, and marveling at the unassuming generosity that had transformed a simple meal into a profound, shared experience. The youngest among them, barely adults, allowed themselves small, fleeting smiles of recognition, tentative gestures that communicated awe and gratitude without a single word. Older prisoners, those who had seen the full brutality of war, felt the quiet swell of emotion in their chests, acknowledging that this was a rare and delicate gift, an affirmation that even after suffering and defeat, humanity could persist. The entire camp seemed imbued with this suspended feeling, a temporary pause from the relentless demands of survival, a moment in which kindness could be observed, absorbed, and remembered. The American guards and cooks, silent and patient observers, moved through the camp with gentle efficiency, aware that the meal had already accomplished more than nourishment alone. They watched the prisoners' reactions without comment, noting the subtle gestures of gratitude, the whispered conversations, the shared glances, and the occasional laughter that spoke volumes about the impact of what had been offered. It was a quiet triumph, a reminder that human generosity, extended without expectation, could resonate more profoundly than any military maneuver or strategic victory. The prisoners responded instinctively to this quiet